Welcome to the Stoic Salon podcast, where we talk about life, love, work, play, the universe, and a bit of Stoicism. Hi, Ranjini. Welcome to the Stoic Salon podcast. I'm so pleased that you're here. Hi, how are you?
Good. Hi, Kathryn. So good to be here. And from our different places on Earth. Me in Toronto and you in Scotland.
And it's a snowstorm there in Toronto.
Yes, it is. Snowing all day. Yeah.
There's been a lot of snow.
I'm a tropical girl because I grew up in Delhi, grew up in Kenya, part of my life in Kenya. So snow is not something I take too easily.
Yeah. Neither do I. I'm not a fan of the cold. I wanted to ask you, so I'm really curious. I'm kind of naming, or at least thematically thinking about this podcast being a series of discussions, about life and the universe between two women, but also Stoicism. And I'm thinking a lot about the concepts of flow and flourish. So kind of a theme is flow to flourish. So the Stoic idea of living in accordance with nature, your human nature. I think it was Zeno maybe who kind of first talked about flow as in living in accordance with nature. And that was the key thing in his philosophy. And also the idea of flourishing. That word just really makes me feel happy, the term flourishing, which I guess for me, it means just doing well. Like, how you doing? I'm doing well, My health's okay, my brain's okay, my body's okay, I got a few dollars in the bank, that sort of thing, flourishing. Mm-hmm. And flourishing also the idea that you're prepared with a toolbox or something in case of something that happens. So you're confident that whatever happens, if things change, if your luck changes, if fate brings something, then you have a sense of confidence that you can, live through whatever it is. So I think flourishing also has a sense of confidence. I don't know. So to start off with the hard questions, how do you feel about flow and flourishing? What do those concepts mean to you?
I think for me, like part of my path was, a lot of my unhappiness when I look back in my 30s, came from my resistance, not flowing with life, but really my resistance to life. Resistance to things I didn't want, resistance to things that had happened in the past, that I wished hadn't happened. I don't think I was flowing with life, and that not flowing with life created unhappiness. It created resistance. So part of my practice and part of my toolbox was learning for me first through the practice of mindfulness and yoga, and the different faith traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, and more recently Stoicism, is learning to just flow with life, and learning to realize, as the Stoics teach us, and as Nhat says, that this is it. I mean, this is our life. And if we don't flourish, and if we are not happy, we would never arrive. Thich Nhat says, you keep chasing happiness, and then you sort of die, and happiness hasn't arrived. And so he reminds us that happiness is here and now. So for me, I think pretty central in my journey towards flow and flourishing has been really trying to flow with life. Looking at things in my life that, as the Stoics would say, are externals that I have no control over, and trying to drop my resistance to it, and flow with it, and practice gratitude. And I think as we drop that resistance and as we make room for gratitude, happiness becomes more a part of our being. So,
I love how you put in one sentence, you put Hinduism, Buddhism, and Stoicism. So I love that. I'm going to ask you, I'm really curious about, because I resisted the whole Eastern tradition. It just didn't seem to really fit in with the way I think I was living a lot in my head. And I think when I finally got to Stoicism, it seemed to me that it starts more in the head and then brings the body into like mindfulness, etc. Whereas the Eastern tradition seems to start more in the body. And this is just my, response to it. But I'm really curious. You're so experienced life-wise, but also theory. I mean, you teach, the Eastern meditation techniques at the University of Toronto. You're into mindfulness and writing. So I'm curious more, could you just tell me a little bit about the Eastern aspect of spirituality, mindfulness? How does the Eastern tradition think about flourishing? Do they have the same term? And then maybe quickly kind of tell me what's the bridge to Stoicism? How do the two traditions kind of relate and how are they different? Well, that's a big question, but anyway, over to you.
Yes, I'll address what I can. I think it's interesting what you say that it starts with the body. So, one of the things that I've trained in is in the Buddhist tradition. So I teach at a Buddhist retreat center in Colorado, in addition to teaching in Toronto. When you give meditation instruction, when you give mindfulness instruction, and I know there's Stoic mindfulness, and in Buddhist mindfulness, when you give instruction, you begin with the body. So the first step is really tuning into your body and connecting to your body and bringing to it non-judgmental, loving awareness, which they call Maitri. So your body may be free of pain. It, may be in pain. You may have a lot of restless energy. You may be in peace. So just connecting to how you feel. So the first step when we give mindfulness instruction is really mindfulness of the body. So just being home in your body and realizing that your body really has come together and will disintegrate, will continue in some other form, perhaps towards the whenever we go. So I think that so the first step is the mindfulness of the body, and then the next step really is mindfulness of breath. So you're still staying very connected to the body. We come into our life with our first breath and we leave with our last. And so this thing that we really have all the time can be a tremendous source of stability and strength and space and stillness. So we tune into the breath. And then the third step is the mindfulness of thoughts. Where you actually acknowledge your thoughts, you notice them. Again, there's no good thought, no bad thought, and you let go and you come back to your breath. Now that's one form, that's shamatha, that's peacefully abiding with your breath. But there is the other form, which is like the view from above, which is there's this, the contemplative aspect of meditation where you actually contemplate a certain word, what it means for you when you experience spaciousness and vastness, and where you actually see yourself as in the view from above as just one thing, because a lot of our unhappiness actually comes from being the claustrophobia of being stuck in our mind, our wants, our desires, our cravings, our ego, our competitiveness, our aggression, our jealousies, comes from that small view when we are stuck in our own mind. So another teacher that I've studied with is Sri Ravi Shankar from the Hindu tradition. And he says that our head is stuck in a tin drum. And when we actually open our palm, open our fist, we see the sky. So in Buddhism, the mind is this vast space, is this vast, the sky of consciousness. And our thoughts are like the clouds that pass through. So part of the practice is really learning to stay, when we have turbulent thoughts, angry thoughts, and acting, learning to stay with those very strong emotions. And it could be depression, it could be suicidal thoughts, it could be, but learning to stay with this, knowing that it will pass. So we build up our resilience to stay. And then once we practice sitting, we gain more stability, we act from a more skillful place. So one of the things that I found in Hinduism, and I sort of began by, I've studied a lot with from the Hindu Vedic tradition with Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, the Kundalini Yoga tradition with Harinam Singh Khalsa, and the Buddhist tradition with Thich Nhat Hanh, and is one of my big teachers, and then the Shambhala Buddhist tradition, and Lama Sultram, who has a temple to the 21 Taras, which is the female Buddha. So what I find with all this is that it brings it all back to you, in a sense. It's mind training. It's how do I work with my afflictive emotions? How do I sabotage myself? How do I escalate suffering for myself and others? How do I flow with circumstances that are, unfortunate or difficult, challenging? How do I realize that just like I suffer, other beings suffer? So we are actually cultivating compassion, practicing compassion in all these traditions. So I find that, all this was really, and that was what, when I came to Stoicism, and I actually came through it through reading Donald Robertson's How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. When I read that, I thought, my goodness, this is exactly what Thich Nhat Hanh says. Because it's all training the mind. How do I work with my mind? In Buddhism, there is that sense that this mind is this precious jewel. And it has the capacity for great resilience and stability and strength. And that, our neurosis and our habitual patterns are like clouds that are covering the sun of this, of the sky of our good, the sun of basic goodness. So the practice of meditation is really uncovering, what is already there, our inherent nature. So we could call it Buddha nature, we could call it, the enlightened sage, whichever word we want to use, Christ consciousness, whatever symbolizes that for you.
It's interesting that you said that the mind is a jewel. It reminded me of Marcus Aurelius. He says at one point to worship your mind, because it's just such a remarkable thing that you've been gifted. How would you... So I know that, mindful practice of the Eastern sort of tradition is very much situated. You kind of sit, you either do a sitting, you sit in your body and then work through it. But the Stoics don't really do that, don't really sit in a spot and meditate in that way. They do something different. Do you have a comment on how Stoic meditation or mindfulness is different to the Eastern tradition?
So, there are different forms of, there's sort of different forms of meditation. So there is walking meditation, which I think, Pythagoras and his followers, and they say Socrates meditated. So there is stillness in different forms. So walking meditation is a part of it. Movement, dance. Is a part of it. When you think of the Sufis and the whirling dervishes, there's movement. So I think if there is more sitting practice in Buddhism, but as Amma, the hugging saint of India, says, we are all climbing the same mountain, but we're just using different techniques and different ways. I think the important thing is accessing stillness. In some form, having that ability to listen to yourself. I remember something that Natalie Goldberg, who did Writing Down the Bones, that almost everyone is familiar with, says, writing is 90% listening. So, part of the practice of meditation is really listening to ourselves, listening to others, listening to the world. So there is that, you have to slow down to listen. It's embodied listening.
It's so interesting that you mentioned listening, because everything lately is bringing to my attention listening. So, we both know Julia Cameron and Natalie Goldberg because we're both creative writers. And so for the listeners, it's just, I'll put it in the show notes, but Natalie Goldberg and Julia Cameron come from the artistic tradition, and talk about creativity and writing as a way into the subconscious, like stream of consciousness journaling as a way of tapping into a story or a truth or something. And Julia Cameron's new book is The Listening Path, I think it's called. Yeah. And then I was also just sent just today about a course that again is focusing on, it spends I think the first week on just listening practice, to tap into, to listen to your inner voice, to go back to the beginning. And I'm really interested in that from a Stoic point of view. Where in the Stoics do the Stoics teach us to just listen? I think that we're so quick to jump in with an opinion, with an analysis, with how does this text, what does this say for me? What is it? Is this about me? And again, it goes back to the idea of the mind being in a metal tin. And we're so self-centered about everything that goes on. We position ourselves as the central protagonist of this drama of life, and everything is about us, and therefore everything we read and everyone we meet has to say something to us, and it just becomes more and more claustrophobic, doesn't it? Because if this person doesn't have anything to say to us, then they're not worth listening to. And so I'm wondering then, with the Stoics, do you have a comment on whether reading the Stoics, encountering the Stoics, added to this practice of just waiting and being quiet and listening? Tell me about that.
I think the person who comes to mind is Marcus Aurelius, who I know we both share so much of admiration for. The fact that here was this man who was, an emperor, and yet we sort of imagine Marcus sort of sitting there with his journal, his notes to himself, and journaling. And I know it's a practice you too, Kathryn, love, just as I do. It's, it's a spiritual practice really, or a sacred practice, whichever word, we want to give. But there is Marcus actually just sitting and listen. What is he doing? I mean, he is taking in what he's learned and contemplating it, but he's listening to himself, distilling that wisdom for himself, making space. So I see listening in that practice, in that ability to actually slow down. But I think that is the danger, and that is the balance. Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh says that all the time, that there has to be a day of rest. It's in all traditions. It's there in, the Sabbath in the Muslim tradition, it's there on Fridays. I lived in the Middle East, Fridays. There was a day off, but the idea that even the earth, just now in winter, right, nothing is growing, but there has to be rest. That we can't keep tilling the soil of our lives. And sometimes there is too much of emphasis on productivity, on outward measurables, on action. The phrase that it's from the space between the notes that music comes. So I think in Buddhism, if you look at it, what did the Buddha do? He sat under a tree and he did nothing. And if you look at the Christian tradition, Jesus goes off to the desert, and he's there for 40 days. There's the idea of stillness, and from this place of stillness, that it's not just action. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, he says that in our culture, there is what he calls the hurry sickness, that we don't stop, that we're constantly doing. And as a result, we don't stop to listen to ourselves. So listening to me is a really important practice. I can't say that I've learned a lot about listening in Stoicism. I've learned more about it in Buddhism. But I have learned in Stoicism, for me, Marcus, as he sits with his journal, is listening. But listening is an important practice for ourselves, so that we listen to our own sorrows, our own dreams. What is it that I really want to do with my life? That we actually connect with ourselves. And for you and me, I know we do that through journaling. And listening is also really important. It's a gift we give to others. Thich Nhat Hanh uses that phrase. He says, listen so that the other person suffers less. And I think it's really important, because I can think of really difficult times in my life when friends of mine actually just listened. So it's non-judgmental, compassionate listening. And that listening, that ability to articulate, what I was feeling, and their listening was life-giving. So I think listening to others is really, listening to others fully comes from presence, which is something Epictetus, and of course in Buddhism we talk a lot about being present. So just being present to the other person. Thich Nhat Hanh actually has a little book called True Love, and one of the mantras of the first mantra is just coming into your own presence, and the second one is, if when you're with someone, and you don't need to say this aloud, but that, darling, you're here. I'm happy you're here. And I would find that, I would drop my daughter off to school in Dubai on my way to work. And sometimes when I was driving in, I was so caught up in my head, and what I had to do for that day and what I had left undone. And then I would use that mantra. I would first actually come into my own body and just be present to myself, and then just be present to her beautiful presence sitting next to me. Her beloved presence. And it didn't mean saying anything to her, but just being present to her presence. So that's listening, So listening is a very powerful practice. And then listening to the world. When we in Buddhism, actually, when we go for walks, in walking meditation, we encourage not to listen to podcasts, not to listen to music, but to just be present, to feel our feet on the floor, on the earth, to listen to the sound of the birds, to really be awake to nature and appreciative of nature. So the world comes alive, I think, through listening. And
that's a really interesting invitation and a real challenge. I was this year, especially, I think with lockdown, really, I really decided I had the intention to learn how to do this thing called meditation, and I downloaded Sam Harris's Waking Up app and would take that on my walks with my dog Henrietta. And lately, maybe the last couple of months, I've stopped taking my phone, and because I was listening to the podcast on the phone, and just trying to do it on my own out there. So walking meditation kind of suits me. And that's interesting. Trying to just listen is, so having the app telling me to listen is one thing, but then doing it without the app telling me, without Sam Harris telling me to listen, that's really hard. And I love everything that you just said. And even just thinking now, rethinking about the meditations and imagining Marcus Aurelius at the end of the day, at the end of a hard day at the battlefield or wherever he was, sitting with the journal. And really, he was listening to the Stoic teachings, wasn't he? Because he doesn't really produce any new groundbreaking philosophy in his meditations. He's rewriting and from memory or paraphrasing the Stoic teachings. So that really was a kind of listening. And then I'm reminded of that meditation where he says, throw away your books. All you have is you have everything in this moment. You don't need to keep searching for the answers. So again, how much do you listen, and to what do you listen? Like, maybe you've heard it all before, so just focus on the present moment. And then I was thinking Arian, who listened to Epictetus to get the discourses down on paper, literally to help others. He actually says that in his prologue, right? He says, I'm going to write down what, so in these discourses, it's not me. I'm not the original writer. And I don't care if anyone thinks I'm not going to be original in this text. I really just wanted to write down what the great teacher Epictetus said, because I want to help, others. And I think, wow, like, I think I'm going to now start turning the conversation to creativity maybe and originality. Because what Arian did then was really just remove himself and his opinion and his everything and just listen to Epictetus and then write that down intentionally for him to have the handbook, and then to offer it to others, what he heard. So that's a creative act in itself. Sometimes we think that listening is a passive act and we're not doing anything new with it, but listening is the start of a creative process, is the start of something. I don't know, do you have any comments do you think I'm moving it in the right direction, our discussion, from listening to some sort of creative act?
I think so, because it connects with, the statement, the quote of Natalie Goldberg's that I said earlier, but that writing is 90% listening. It is 90% listening. So I think that, with creativity, we may have an idea of what we want a book to be, but the book sometimes wants to be something else. And I remember my first experience about 20 years ago, whenever that was, I was at Iowa City for a writing workshop, and it was my first writing workshop. And I was taking this class and we were given this assignment, and I was trying to write on my mother. But at that point, I didn't really, that was not the pressing thing, but I was trying to write a story that would not reveal too much about anything. And I kept trying to work on it, and I could feel that the writing was really stuck and wasn't really moving. And then towards the end of the evening, and I knew I had to submit something the next day, I actually wrote a story that was trying to push through. And that was that story came quickly, and that was my first published story.
Wow.
And it came really fast. So partly in writing is this receptivity, is this allowing, is this removing of the censor that says, no, I don't want to write about that. So part of writing, really, at least creative writing, is that vulnerability, to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. And there is a lot of strength I've discovered through showing that vulnerability. I mean, when you read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and you just read it as the Meditations, he is human. He may have been born, almost 2,000 years, all these years before, but, me, a Delhi girl, all these years later, can connect to him and find strength, through his words, because there is that shared humanity. He's just a man. He's just a human being. He's vulnerable. He's reminding himself of mortality. He's reminding himself of how hollow fame is. He's reminding himself of what really matters. He's reminding himself not to get upset by the judgments of others, and that today I will meet, people who will, act in, I've forgotten his exact words, troublesome. What does he say? I love that.
Idiotic. I'll meet idiots.
say to yourself at the start of the day, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable people. And of course, in the context of being an emperor, he experienced it on a much larger scale. But then reminding himself that, they are the hands and the eyelids and the two rows of teeth, that we're all interconnected. So I think creativity comes from this willingness to really, to allow ourselves to be vulnerable. For me, my form is mainly this short story and the novel and the memoirs. So those are forms that really, where you do, there's no point writing a memoir. I'm working on a memoir, and I was talking to my mother the other day, and she said, but are you going to write about that? And I said, Mom, unless I write the truth, there's no point in writing. So there is that, this writing, which a writer told me when I started off. She said, if you want to be a writer, you have to write without fear. So I think that, that's part of what writing is. And I think as a Stoic and as a creative writer, it's this, every profession, every vocation has its challenges. And, as a creative writer, we have to go to those places. We have to go to our obsessions. We have to go to the shadows. We have to go to the places of suffering. And yet bring ourselves back through our practice.
That is so interesting, because you've brought up vulnerability, and I'm thinking again, like I'm totally rethinking the meditations as you speak now. And Marcus Aurelius, though what he wrote in that little private diary to himself is not an emperor's words, right? They're just so tender and sensitive, and that's totally vulnerable. That's real vulnerability. He was so honest in those quiet moments before bedtime, I guess. I'm imagining it's bedtime. And that's such a hugely creative act, isn't it? Like, he's actually writing down the truth, his truth. And that's really profoundly human. And yeah, that I never really thought of. I think I wasn't sure about the Stoics, because coming from a literary background, I found the writing quite stale and boring, and it didn't have, the high drama that I really liked, or, But when I read Marcus Aurelius, and I only read Marcus Aurelius a few years ago, that's when I fell in love with, him, obviously, and with the potential of Stoicism. His work is so stunning. It's so beautiful. And I think that's what it is then, Ranjini. It's like he's actually just going deep, listening to himself and the teachings, and reminding himself gently, prodding himself gently to just stay focused. And even the exercise of stripping things, seeing them for what they are. Really difficult mental exercises, especially for an emperor who pretty much had everything, and could literally have lived a life with that illusion, because no one would have taken it. He'd never have, lost anything. I know he suffered, maybe got sick towards the end, right? Was he suffering ill at the end?
Yeah, he was. He died eventually of the
smallpox.
The smallpox, of the plague. And then there is the thing that he was in pain, stomach pain.
Yeah.
So I think what resonates, and I think why his work has lasted, is this vulnerability, is the fact that he's writing as a human being. And there are times that, for me, working with my mind and training my mind is incremental, slow progress. It's something I do every day. I will, do it even, as I pass on. It's just continual, right? We're always working with our mind. And there have been times when, I just feel all over the place, or I just sit at my desk and, I cry over something that has happened, and I just flip open the meditations. And I read a few of the verses of the meditations, and it steadies me, and that light comes through. And I think that's the power of writing. That's the power of words. And that's the power of his purity of intention. A lot of, I teach in the creative writing program, and a lot of students want publication almost immediately, almost quickly. But here's Marcus actually writing and giving it care, distilling this wisdom, what he's learned, without having it contaminated by this desire for success and fame. And, I want this book to be read. He imagines himself forgotten, but here we are. And I think that's why one of the things that emerges from the meditations for me is his vulnerability and his tremendous humility. To me, it's an unimaginable humility. Like, how do you, possess such power and not abuse it? Because what we see in our world is people abusing power. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. In Marcus Aurelius, it doesn't. So how does he have all this power? And yet for him, the most important thing is his character. That's the most important thing. And how does he go through loss and difficulty, and how does he work with that? Without, how does he not just endure his fate, amor fati, but how does he love his fate? How does he learn to love it? Because I endure the things that happen to me at times. And then I tell myself, come on, love your fate. And here's my coffee mug.
Oh my goodness.
Aurelius coffee mug. But I think that's the universality of the human experience. That here is a person from thousands of years ago who speaks to me at a different time, from a different culture, and speaks to me and actually uplifts me and gives me strength to continue and to live my life well. And I think that is, as creative writers and as writers, that is the power of words.
Something you said really resonated with me, and it's something that I struggle with, and I think we all struggle with this as modern day beings, maybe more so than people did 2,000 years ago, but I don't know. But the idea of not only our mortality, but of being forgotten. And so a lot of us, and everyone I've met, being a writer, I'm meeting people every day who are writing their memoirs. In fact, even my whole the coaching and the work that I'm doing is with people who actually want to leave behind a legacy, and that means a story in some form of publication, not necessarily for big publication, but publication for family, community, or the local library. So somewhere where their story will sit and exist for future generations. And then, of course, Marcus Aurelius at one point says that, not only are you going to die, the people who will live longer than you are going to die. Mm-hmm. So that means that even if they remember you for 50 years longer or 50 years after you die, they're going to die. And so they'll take their memory with them. So there's actually no guarantee that anything we do will be remembered. And in my Stoic Salon, it's my little Stoic group online on Facebook, we're currently reading Ryan Holiday's The Lives of the Stoics. And last week we read Zeno, the second Zeno of Tarsus. And he was kind of, second generation Stoicism. And he just kind of almost got forgotten. So none of his works survived, and it was only by virtue of some mention of him that we even know. So in Ryan Holiday's book, he's literally got 2.5 pages or something like that, almost forgotten. And Marcus Aurelius knows this, and yet he is cobbling together, writing this text only for himself. There's no, no ambition for anyone to read it, which of course it is why it's so authentic and so beautiful and so human and so vulnerable, I guess. I don't even know if vulnerability was a word back then, but anyway, it definitely is. And then I'm thinking Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, he's got a very, very clear intention of being remembered. In fact, he says to Lucilius, forget all the things that you think are going to make you famous. Just do something good. And because we're writing to each other and I'm going to mention you in my letters and my letters are going to be remembered, you will be remembered. So Seneca's got this entirely different perspective. So, we're both creative writers and writers. And so what do you have to say about writing first of all, what do you say about even the courage to write when you know what? It might not be remembered, or maybe your book, maybe the server on which Amazon is keeping your book dies forever and it'll be lost. And then the courage to write even if you'll be remembered. And also, what does that mean for the creative act if it itself is impermanent? I don't know. I don't know what these questions are. Do you have anything?
I mean, I've thought about these things a lot, being a writer. But the way I look at it is that I'm here, and, the orchid in my meditation room blossoms. It's actually going through its third blooming, and it's beautiful. And there are all these beautiful blossoms. And it blossoms because its nature is to blossom. And it gives joy to me. The orchid is impermanent. I'm impermanent. And the same thing, I think that, my essential nature, when I was in grade 5, I wanted to be a teacher. So I've taught since 1987. So I've taught for many, many years. And so here I think there is something in me that loves to teach, and there is something in me that loves to write. So that's what I do. And I think I try to purify my intention, because it's really hard in this culture to not focus constantly on outward productivity, success, fame, especially with all these things, with instant fame on the internet, right? But to actually just work with the writing itself. And so the fact of whether anything I write, a lot of my journaling, of course, is just for me. But the fact of whether anything I write will be published, whether it will be read, whether it will be not read, is an external. And I think that's all it is. It's, but this is again something where Marcus has helped me. And I remember I once sent in something and I got this, I've had some success and I've had some failures. And I got this really scathing letter from someone who didn't understand my book or whatever, didn't like it. And I walked up and I had tears and I sat down and I wanted, it was my writing time to sit down and write again. And I read this from Marcus. He says, if you accomplish the task set before you, following right reason and with dedication, steadfastness and good humor, and you never allow secondary issues to distract you, but keep the deity within you pure and upright, as if you might have to surrender it at any moment. If you hold on to this, awaiting nothing and fleeing from nothing, but remaining satisfied, if your present action is in accordance with nature, you will live a happy life and no one can stand in your way.
Which one is that? Which meditation is that one?
This is book 3, and this is the Robin Hard translation. Book 3, verse 12.
12. Oh, my goodness.
And in book 2, and he said that in book 2, verse 5, he says, at every hour, Devote yourself in a resolute spirit as befits a Roman and a man. So I put an Indian woman and a Canadian to fulfilling the task in hand with a scrupulous and unaffected dignity and with love for others and independence and justice. If you perform every action as though it were your last, freed from dissatisfaction with what is allotted to you, you will see how few are the things that a person needs to master if he is to live a tranquil and God-fearing life. So these sentences have helped me tremendously because it brings me back to free myself from external considerations, to just be with the work and do that. And that, and what he says is that this tranquil life, this happy life, this contented life is available. That's all, you just have to learn these skills.
Ranjini, I just remembered, because I was looking at your University of Toronto profile and all the courses that you're teaching, and one of them is a Dear Marcus, a letter writing course that's come up.
The Dear Diary.
Dear Diary.
Yeah. So there is a Dear Diary that's in the fall. That is actually Thich Nhat Hanh's palm leaves, fragrant palm leaves that he wrote in the 1960s. So I'll be, the Buddhist principles that you see there, the Diary of Anne Frank.
And Marcus Aurelius.
And Marcus Aurelius's meditations. So,
okay.
So that's coming up. And then there is the Stoicism and the Good Life, which is happening next month. And also Mindfulness, Stoicism, and Writing for Discipline and Productivity. So I use a lot of the principles that I've actually learned through Stoicism and through mindfulness. What I consider genuine productivity,
For creative writers, productivity for writers.
Actually, that class has people from, some are from the business background, from different backgrounds, so not just creative.
So I kind of I love these free-ranging discussions, but I also want to sort of pull out, just practical things for us, me, and whoever tunes in and listens. Some sort of, because Stoicism for me obviously is not an armchair philosophy. It's interesting to talk about this, and but one thing I've learned is that Stoicism requires a daily practice. And I'm curious about everyone's practices. Like the Stoics do have clear teachings and recommendations. But the more I speak to modern day Stoics, the more I see that people are kind of creating their own little practices. So I'm curious about you. In terms of productivity, what are you teaching in that course? Or just give me some...
Yeah, in the mindfulness and so it's mindfulness, Stoicism, and writing for discipline and productivity. So the writing, that particular course is in the mindfulness program. So it's not really geared just for creative writers. So I use the writing, the generative writing, and the prompts to really connect with yourself. So you connect with your own values, your missions, your goals, and I've drawn from Stoicism. So the things sort of Marcus says in the morning, that kind of, and I know you've done a lot with intention and goal setting. And then at the end of the day, like Pythagoras and Seneca say, looking at your day and looking at, what did I do well? What did I leave out? What could I have done better? So looking at each day, as Seneca says, as a life. So this goes back to what Thich Nhat Hanh says, that this is it, that this day is what we have. I use strategies like activity scheduling. Donald has a really nice video on that, on activity scheduling. Looking at the hours of the day. I also look at balance, so that our so in productivity, we have the outside productivity, but we also have things like procrastination, perfectionism and fear, which sabotage us. And often what we think is laziness is not always laziness. There are other things operating. So connecting. So in this course, partly is inside out, connecting with ourselves, connecting to our perfectionism, connecting to our goals, connecting to if we're writing a book, what kind of book do I want to write? What are the projects that really matter to me? What are the thought formations that I want to, put out? What is the work that I really want to engage in? So prioritizing that, aligning it with our values, and connecting to our stumbling blocks within us. And then outside in, where you do the activity scheduling, where you
What is activity scheduling?
Activity scheduling is something actually so I have this little thing here, and it's basically it's hour by hour. Now I don't do the evenings, I just do.
Is that just like a normal diary?
Yeah, it has like 7 p.m. I have here journaling, book time. It's learning to see where your time is going.
Oh, okay.
And I as I started doing it, I realized that I underestimated the amount of time I spend washing up, doing laundry, errands. So being realistic about where my time was going. And then, and strategies, like if you're depressed, and I know in CBT they talk about that, say, okay, from 6 to 6:30, I'm going to be depressed, but now I have to write, so I'm going to write now. But from 6 to 6:30 p.m. this evening, I'm going to allow myself to be depressed. And, so there is that, even the scheduling, that you schedule that in. Because I found that prior to that my days would go and I thought, where is my time going? So just understanding time. And with that, the mindfulness practice of balancing, so that we are not always operating with overwhelm and anxiety and overwork, but that we have time for rest and for, what we call play. But that there is time for rest, so that we're not always working. So that's a key in mindfulness practice. Like people like Emirati and Thich Nhat Hanh and all talk about it, is that the more you slow down, actually, the more productivity there is. Like Thich Nhat Hanh has over 100 books. The Dalai Lama actually meditates for 4 hours every day. So that actually, paradoxically, when you meditate, when you slow down, and the productivity does not always have to be visible productivity.
So what would be an example of non-visible productivity?
For example, when I think of, sitting still, sitting on the cushion, where you're meditating is not visible. When you journal, I journal for quite a bit. I journal for, quite a long time, every single day. It's not visible. So these are things we just do for ourselves, yeah. And maybe, working on a book that you decide that you're writing, but you necessarily may not even want it out in the world, like Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah. Which is your favorite? So you said you're with Marcus Aurelius. You read from the Robin Hard translation. There are quite a few translations of the meditations. Would Robin Hard's translation be your favorite? Is it just one that you came across? Have you explored the translations?
Yeah, I have different translations. I have the Gregory Hayes translation. Then I have some, other ones that I picked up in grad school, which I don't even use anymore. But yeah, the Gregory Hayes and the Robin Hard, yeah.
Yeah.
So those are my favorite ones, yeah.
Yeah.
So I look at books. It's interesting, yeah.
You look at both. And do you kind of rewrite them at all in your own words?
Yes, I do. I have been having so much fun, with actually rewriting the meditations, just doing that, working. So, like, for example, Marcus Aurelius has bread, for instance, in the course of its baking, tends to crack open here and there. And yet these very cracks somehow appeal to us. And again, figs, when fully ripe, tend to split open. Olives, when they're ready to drop. The wrinkled brows of a lion, the foam dripping from the wild boar. And so,
which meditation is that one? Could you remind me?
It is from book 3. And that is so poetic. So poetic. Book 3, verse 2. And then I, as I modeled it, I said so much of our suffering comes from our resistance to imperfection. We want ourselves, want others, want circumstances to be perfect. Remind yourself that there is beauty in the cracks on the bread, in ripe figs and olives, in ears of corn bending towards the earth, the wrinkled brow of a lion, and the foam around a boar's mouth. So just for me, working, and as I know you do that, Kathryn, a lot, is just rewriting, which is a part of, Buddhist practice too. And then also engaging with the text, like, what does it mean for me? And then I actually look at how Marcus Aurelius was he was focused on the process. Which is something Gandhi says too, 100% be focused on the process, not on the outcome. And, knowing the illusory nature of fame, success, and money, doing one's work with complete attention and joy, and not distracted by secondary issues such as craving, jealousy, aggression, tears, inadequacy, hope, and fear. The work, honorable in its intention and execution, is sufficient unto itself.
Which meditation is that one?
That was me rewriting the last one.
Rewriting 3.2.
But that was me rewriting 3.12. Yeah. When he says, if you accomplish a task without being distracted.
Yeah. Yes, I do the rewriting practice, and when I came to Stoicism a few years ago, I was going through writer's block, and creative writers always go through writer's block. And I realized that writer's block was not because I didn't have any ideas. It never is that, isn't it? There's always something else. And I figure it was probably a mix of generalized anxiety and depression or something like that. So I came to the Stoics wanting a quick fix, fix that for me, please, Epictetus, and let me get back to life. But then started reading Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life, and the chapter on spiritual exercises, and we've talked about this, just blew my mind that there were a whole lot of exercises that Pierre Hadot found almost that we've kind of inherited from, I think it was Philo of Alexandria who in his extracts, any extant writings, had a list of things that the ancients did in terms of writing as practice. So paraphrasing, copying, memorizing. And then I read something that Donald Robertson wrote on his Medium blog, where he found Fronto's instructions to Marcus Aurelius on how to approach the teachings and how to really do a close reading of the text, and then really look at the words, like the word choice, and find so in Marcus's rewriting of it in his notebooks during his training with Fronto, to actually really look at the words and study the words, make sure the word is accurately chosen, not chosen because it's, sounds good. And then in his paraphrasing to really be accurate. And what Pierre Hadot calls this is this process of rhetorical amplification. So to actually, in your study of the texts, in rewriting them, to choose the words and the syntax and the paraphrasing that really amplifies the content, because the purpose was to make it so striking to you that you would remember it, right? It's all part of memorization. So I've actually done a couple of challenges in my Stoic Salon group, and did like monthly challenges where, you know, I send out an email and there's a little extract from, I've done Marcus Aurelius. And then what we do is like we just sit quietly with the text and then just copy it, literally word for word, copy the extract. The part of the meditation. Some of the meditations are longer, so we'll cut them short. And then we might do a bit of paraphrasing or a bit of, summarizing, bullet points, and then finally reconstruction and reformulating. And in one of the reasons why I like the Gregory Hayes translation is his introduction to the meditations. And he talks about the literary style of Marcus Aurelius and how it's absolutely unique in that it's Marcus Aurelius working with working at the textual level, like reformulating, rewriting, re-expressing the teachings to make it more memorable to him. So this process of memorizing through writing, I think it's remarkable. And one of the most impressive sort of things that we do, well, I mean, people have come back doing my challenges. It's copying. Everyone is blown away by copying because we don't do that. We don't sit quietly and just going back to the listening. Copying is really listening, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And so no one does that. Like everyone's there with a book, highlighting and then going on Facebook and quoting or talking about it. But there's no time and space to just sit and with the book and then copy the text and really listen to the text. And then I remember, because we've had this discussion before, you mentioned that you mentioned a couple of artists who work and sort of have a very strong meditation
Mayumi.
Practice. Yeah. And what does she do?
Mayumi Oda, she writes, she draws the Buddhist goddesses in these are all Buddhist goddesses in very contemporary ways. They even have pubic hair,
wow.
But she's incredible. She writes the Heart Sutra, as a way of settling in. And you find that everywhere, that even this sort of the repetition, whether it's verbal in Hinduism and in Buddhism of the chants, like Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Tare Tu Tare Ture Soha, like you repeat the mantra, it can be written or it can be said. And you have that in the Catholic tradition with, I think, the Hail Mary. It's a way of actually quietening the mind to stillness. So you use breath, but you can also use words. You can use mantra, sound. But yeah, this idea of actually, it goes back as a creative writing teacher. Kathryn, I remind students that Kathryn Mansfield said, in a short story, every word must count. Every word must count. Raymond Carver would have about 37 drafts of his short story. And it's the same kind of attention to every word. And, so if you can use one word instead of 4 or 5, use that one word. So this kind of, attention to detail is important. But I think so much of society now is really, getting out there. I think we need time to sit with the text. We need time to actually let it percolate, to understand. And that's what I mean by there is so much of a focus on outward, immediate productivity. And this illusory idea of fame, that I'm going to write this book that's going to be, and maybe you will, maybe you won't, but it doesn't matter. What matters is, as Marcus Aurelius says, that you sit at your desk, that you give it the attention it deserves, and your 100% presence and engagement with that material. So in meditative traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on dispassion and engagement. that, you engage 100% with the process, but you also are dispassionate about the outcome. So I am amazed. Like, a book that I really like is the Socrates Express by Eric Weiner. Great book. And his chapter on Gandhi, he has a chapter on Marcus Aurelius, how he finds it hard to get out of bed in the morning. Do you want to lie under the covers, or do you want to go and get up? But this chapter on Gandhi, where, and he sort of reminded me what Gandhi says, drawing from the Bhagavad Gita, that the process has to be 100%. And for the process to be, as a writer, you spend hours in solitude, writing, connecting to your work. And you can write with other writers too, but there's a lot of solitude in that process. Mm. You have to be patient with the work. I've been working on my memoir, and I had this idea that it would go really fast, but it's going slow. And I told myself, it's going to take as much time as it takes.
Yeah. Yeah. What was the book, the Eric Weiner book? What was the title of that one?
The Socrates Express.
The Socrates Express.
It's, so every chapter has a different philosopher. There's Socrates, there's Rousseau, there's Marcus Aurelius, who didn't drink coffee but managed to get up. I sort of wake up with my morning cup of coffee in the Marcus Aurelius mug, but but he didn't have coffee, but he had to get out of bed.
What do you think he drank in the morning? What did he drink in the morning, Marcus Aurelius?
I don't know.
We'll have to ask Donald.
Yes.
Maybe it's in the book. Maybe it's in the How to Think Like a Roman Emperor book. I want to bring the conversation now to Stoic on X Women, because that's happening in June and you're going to be speaking there. I was talking to someone the other day who asked me, is it an exclusive event just for women? And obviously it's not. It's an all-inclusive event. Do you have any comments about women and Stoicism, and not ancient women necessarily, but us today? Have we encountered Stoicism in a particular way? Do we talk about it in a particular way? Is it even relevant to bring up the question? I mean, clearly, because we've got this Stoic on X conference with the theme women, or with the focus women. Why? What does it mean to have a Stoic on X women? How do you feel about participating, and what will you be talking about? And any comments on just that?
Well, I think it sort of started off, more with men. I think Stoicism, whether you're a man or a woman or however you identify yourself, it has something to offer to you. So Marcus Aurelius, helps me, and it's immaterial to me whether he had a female body or a male body, right? It's his words that I respond to. But of course, the experience he reflects is a male experience at that particular point of time. But I think this initiative to include more women, to actually spread the net wide, is a good one. And I think there has to be more of it. And I think it's really a good initiative, because that's a question I was asked even at an interview a while ago. Does Stoicism really, because a lot of people see Stoicism as a very white male thing, but it's not, But I think that's part, like anything that, anything that sort of moves forward in time will morph and change and grow.
Do you think there are issues that, I know that the emotions come up a lot when we talk about women, emotions, management of emotions, even though I know that with men, emotions such as anger, etc., are really big topics. What are the main issues, I guess, with women? And do you have a comment on women and emotions? Because that traditionally has been a bit of a controversial issue with women being more emotional. what a so any comments on that, and any comments then on how women who may actually identify with being more emotional, would Stoicism be a practice that could help, and how?
So, I don't know if everyone will agree with me, but really I think what the world has seen has been too much of patriarchy. The male principle, when it's balanced, is good. And I think within all of us, there is both the female and the male principle. But what we've seen really is aggression, even today, and it breaks my heart, in parts of the world where women are still dominated by men, are still abused. And so historically, so much of violence has happened against women, perpetuated against women. And I think one of the reasons as women, we also respond to Marcus Aurelius is, here is a man who has, as it should be in both men and women, we have both principles. It's balanced. We see his ability to connect to his emotions. We see his gentleness. And I think that's one of the appeal of this masculine Roman emperor, is that here's this man who can actually was powerful, who had power, who did great things, who ran an empire, but yet he is able to connect to his vulnerability and his emotions, his sense of questioning himself, even inadequacy at times, all these things. And I think and who's able to look at nature and see the beauty in nature. Now, I would say that the masculine principle, when it's not in alignment, is unable to do those things. Mm-hmm. The masculine principle, when it's not in alignment, is aggressive. And what happens then is not in touch with because it's not in touch with its vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I think when as human beings, we don't connect with our vulnerability, when we don't listen to ourselves, whether we're male or female, we don't connect to our suffering, it can morph for men and women in aggression and in anger and in power and in those kinds of things. So one of the courses that I teach at the University of Toronto that I started some years ago is called Pilgrimage to the Sacred Feminine. So I work with the representations of the feminine in Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity, so the Black Madonna, the Blue Madonna, Tara, Kuan Yin, Vaishnadevi, Kali. So I think that it's really, women have been associated with emotions and the word hysteria, but I think one of the greatest strengths of women, and a strength that we can actually, that men, like Marcus Aurelius knew, I think, is to be able to connect to your emotions. Mm. And I think the balance of those two principles is alignment. So in Buddhism, in tankas, you see the male and the female in union, and it's symbolic for the male and the female principle to be in harmony. Mm. So there is, I think, this healing has to take place of the masculine consciousness, and for the women in a different way from all the ways that we've been hemmed down and circumscribed. Mm. So one of my favorite goddesses that I teach, she's not, a bodhisattva, is Tara. And way back, the monks told her that only in a male form can you get enlightenment. So Tara, who's considered a female Buddha, said that I will reincarnate again and again, but only in a female's body, and I will gain enlightenment in a female's body. And so she's really the female Buddha. And in the place that I teach, Tara Mandala in Colorado, there is a temple of the 21 Taras. And it's Tara in different colors and different manifestations. And this is something I remember I once told you, Kathryn, I said, you're the Tara of action. Like each Tara is different. So each Tara has a different activity that she is strong in, and so part of our journey is really finding out what are our strengths and, celebrating our strengths and developing those strengths.
How do you spell her name?
Tara.
Tara. I have one more quick question. Well, I don't know if it's quick, but so Tara kept sort of reincarnating in order to, and then found, I assume, enlightenment. Now, the Stoics had this their cosmology, their physics included a sense of like the conflagration of the universe. So there was a sense of reincarnation. They believed in reincarnation of some sort, right? Not in the Eastern kind of idea, but this kind of eternal recurrence. I don't know why I brought this up now, but what do you have to say about that? I know that modern physics sort of doesn't really suggest anything like that, but what do you think about the concept of reincarnation from both an Eastern and a kind of more Western Stoic?
So Thich Nhat Hanh, who I've referred to so many times and who I sort of see as, someone I've learned from a lot. I've learned a lot from. He says that there is no birth, no death, only continuation. So he says energy cannot die. So according to him is that, the way he phrases it is that, after death, he says a cloud cannot die. The cloud becomes the water in your tea or the rain. So we may not be in the same form, but the fact that, there is some kind of continuation. He does say that when we pass on, he says our actions, and I would say Marcus Aurelius would agree with that, our actions are our only belongings, our character. Our actions are our only belongings. So that's all we have. So not the fame, nothing else but what we did. So to me, like Marcus Aurelius says that at one point, he says God or atoms. Now, I teach at a Buddhist retreat center, and I'm very familiar with Buddhism. And I remember once my kids asked me, they said, what if there's nothing after death? I said, if there was nothing, there's nothing that I would do differently. And it's actually almost unimportant if there is something after death or not. I think the important thing is that you live your life well. And I think that's what Stoicism teaches, and that's what Buddhism teaches. And that's what, these traditions teach, whether it's faith or secular traditions, is that I'm alive now, like that orchid. How can I live in happiness? How can I live happily and, with tranquility, like the Epicureans would say? But also, how can I engage? How can I be of benefit? How can I use my talents to benefit others? And, yes, we might be forgotten, but at least while we are here at this time, we live fully. And I think it's interesting to me in Stoicism, because I studied existentialist philosophy and in literature, is that we can use this, we can use impermanence, and we can use this nothing, and we can see it as absurd, or we can actually make meaning out of it. And so I choose to make meaning. But, who is to say, really? That's my take.
And I like how you added that word choice, because ultimately what I've learned from Stoic practice is that the choice is in here. It's in my head. And I choose to live well. I choose to not focus on what's going to happen after life, because I can't know. There's a mystery out there. Even quantum physicists don't know what's happening out in the universe. The universe is much more complicated and mysterious than we even imagined. So it's not about knowing, is it? It's about living your best life and living in accordance with nature, which is basically living within your sphere of control, which is just you, your character, your intention to act well. And I think even Marcus Aurelius at one point, and you mentioned the bit about, either God or atoms, there's a sense of agnosticism there. He's open to the fact that it's a mystery. He doesn't know, he can't know, but that doesn't distract him from living the best life, living virtuously, being a good man, a good human in the present moment. And it doesn't matter who's going to remember him or how powerful he is. That's the key. So if someone came to you and said, okay, how can I live like Marcus Aurelius? You'd probably say, read Donald's book. But what would you recommend that someone, if they came to you with that question, which Stoic text, I think I know what you're going to say, but which Stoic text would you recommend they start with?
Would I recommend?
Which Stoic text and which practice?
Which Stoic text and which practice?
Like a daily thing to do and a daily thing to read.
So I would say, for me, as you know, it's been the meditations, and yes, Donald's book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And just as an aside, he had a really funny tweet the other day where he had this image of his name on the gravestone.
Yes.
Yes. And he says, that he wouldn't be regretting how much time not having spent enough time on Twitter, which really goes back to the core idea. I think is that, just as we engage with these texts, is just identifying for ourselves, what are your core values? And so that everything then, that the work you do, the way you live your life, is aligned to those core values. And I think to me, that is, and then I love the view from above meditation that I've actually listened with. Donald has done a podcast on that, and it's part of the Stoic mindfulness resilience training too, where you actually just see that instead of it being all about me, I'm just one little speck in this whole thing. But just like that orchid blossoms beautifully and brings joy to my heart, I can blossom with kindness and good intention and bring joy to others and to myself.
How do you do the view from above meditation?
Donald has a podcast on the view from above, which was in the Stoic mindfulness resilience training, which I have a download. So I've listened to that. Yeah. I've listened to it a few times, but I actually it's part of my Buddhist meditation practice where you just sort of, you begin with yourself, and then there's a sense of vastness and spaciousness, that you just extend outwards. And so if you're suffering something, you extend outwards to that all beings, that at this very moment of time, there may be others suffering the same loss or the same, illness or the same physical, the difficulty that whatever I'm going through. So you learn, and the same thing goes with the practice of compassion, that you extend it out. I think the most important thing that I would regret, and I've identified that for myself, and I think that's important, just figuring out what it is that is important for you, is that when I died, and that could be today, tomorrow, whenever, when I die, before I died, before I passed on, if I had the sense that I hadn't made good use of my life, that I hadn't tried to improve my character, that I hadn't been kind, that I had wasted my time, that I hadn't tried to learn, that I hadn't put in 100% effort, that I hadn't enjoyed just play and being, those are the things that would make me sad. So I think just identifying what it is that is most important for me. And so while I'm alive, actually directing my attention to those things, so that when I pass on, I can tell myself, I have all these flaws, but at least I've tried to work on my character. I've tried to be a better person. I've tried to help others. I've tried to cultivate compassion. I've tried to cultivate kindness. I've tried to manage my time. I've tried to do work that I feel will be useful. and has given me joy and may benefit others. I think that is, I've tried to read wisdom literature, good books that will expand my mind. So I think of philosophy, as being a lover of wisdom, right? So that I am a lover of wisdom. So just this feeling that I've used this life, whether it continues or whether it doesn't continue, that I've used it well. And that my actions, that my actions have come from this place. So I think that's where Stoicism, Buddhism has really helped me, because it constantly, as we soak ourselves in it, that image of the die, right? It slowly dies the thought. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. And I know that you're doing that, Kathryn, with all your heart and soul and being. Because we see our own, each one of us, we see our habitual patterns, we see our our neurotic behaviors, we see our flaws, we see our inadequacies, and we want to work on them. So we work on it with loving kindness.
And it has to be, you said reminder, and it has to be a daily thing, because the nature of the human mind, like I was talking to Brittany Pollett on this podcast the other day, and I live next to a cemetery, a little cemetery. There's not much action there, but still it's a cemetery. And Brittany was saying, wow, that's a memento mori, if ever there was one. But you can actually live next to a cemetery and not contemplate your own mortality for days. You can just forget. So I think the human mind has this amazing capacity to be distracted. And what I love about sitting with Marcus Aurelius every day, which I've kind of slipped a bit, is that he constantly reminds himself to be focused. And not just in that, Silicon Valley productivity sense, but just to be focused on the moment and on good and virtue and what he has to do, what I think a lot of us come to self-help books or philosophy, and we read the book and we go, okay, read the book, put it away now, done. And it's not like that at all.
No.
You need a daily practice, and that's what's interesting about Stoicism. It's not just reading the books. It's just, and you don't even need lots of books. You just need Marcus Aurelius, really, and you just keep reading it. And Marcus says, I said this before, throw away the books, throw away other books. You just need this one book. You don't need an Amazon list of books of, every book written on Stoicism to get Stoicism. You can actually just sit with Marcus Aurelius over and over again. And that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
Oh my God, I could probably sit with you for like hours talking more. We've talked about so much. Thank you. That was really amazing.
Thank you for doing this. It's always such a pleasure hanging out with you and,
you too.
and talking. Yeah, it's just, I think part of the progress and path that, in spiritual traditions, like in Buddhist traditions, they say Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. The Buddha is whatever, the awakened mind, and the awakened mind could be the enlightened sage. And the Dharma is the wisdom text, and the Sangha is community. That all three things are sort of essential on the path.
And what's interesting, Ranjini, is that for a long time, I'd kind of really forgotten about the importance of community until I came across Donald Robertson's site, found Modern Stoicism, then did my first Stoic week, and realized that, oh my God, Stoicism's like really social. Like you have to actually talk to people. You can't just go and sit in your armchair and read the philosophy and learn. You actually have to join a Stoa or some community and communicate. So suddenly I found myself, it was 2016, I think, I was in Boston. And I'm like online meeting all these Stoics thinking, oh my God, this is the most social I've been in a long time. Then, of course, set up my little group, my quiet little group. And yeah, so that's really interesting, constantly being and sort of fronting the community. I now do my Stoic Salon. We've got a weekly book club thing where you actually have to read a chapter, but then you have to go and talk about it with others and, listen. And so that is definitely part of the practice. It's not enough to sit isolated and do your Stoic homework, is it?
So I have a quick question for you. What began your path on? What was the book? What got you onto Stoicism?
Yeah, okay, I'll try and say it really quickly. So obviously I'm a philosophy undergraduate. So I studied philosophy at the University of Sydney, and on campus, you don't do the Stoics because the Stoics aren't considered. You do Plato, Aristotle, and then you jump ahead to Hume or Locke or someone, right? So all that in between is kind of the dark age of philosophy, and it's not important. But off campus, about 10 minutes down the road from the University of Sydney, is a Greek taverna. It still exists. Back in the day, we used to meet there, and Ed Spence, who is a philosopher, was a friend of mine, is a friend of mine, and he was born in Cyprus, and is from Cyprus, but maybe was born. Yeah, I think he was born in Cyprus. So Zeno was a big thing, and Ed would write philosophy plays, and we'd perform it at the taverna, and it was kind of a symposium, and so I learned about the Stoics through Ed and Zeno, but I found them pretty boring. I found them boring because they weren't creative, and they weren't, the words weren't fiery, because I was a philosophy English student. Anyway, years pass. I end up in Greece, and I lived in Athens for a bit, and then lived on the west coast in Preveza, which is where Nicopolis, the ancient site of Nicopolis, is, which is where Epictetus ended up after he left Rome and set up his school there. So I literally lived really close to the ancient city of Nicopolis, which is Caesar Augustus's victory city after he beat Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. And again, at that point in time, do you know Tom Wolfe's A Man in Full?
Tom Wolfe's what?
A Man in Full.
No, I don't. Yeah.
So it was a novel that came out, I think, late 90s. And in it, there's a character who's in jail, and he asks for a book. And by mistake, he gets sent Epictetus's book. And so he starts reading the Stoics and gets really into the Stoics. And so I came across the Stoics again via Tom Wolfe, and I was in Preveza, and I started reading Epictetus. Again, found it a bit boring, wasn't really interested in it. And then traveled a lot, ended up in Boston, and was feeling really anxious due to sort of certain personal circumstances. I think a lot of people come to Stoicism because of a hardship or some sort of point in their life where something has to change, something needs to pivot, some turning point. And that was it for me. So at that point, I think it was around 2015, and I was anxious. I couldn't write. I was scared of death, like badly scared of death, and sort of started looking at cognitive behavioral therapy. I bought like CBT for Dummies or something and started working through that. And then the Google algorithms led me to Donald Robertson's site, Modern Stoicism. And then I did my first Stoic week, and then read Epictetus a bit, did the activities, and thought, okay, this might be interested. But at that point, I was really thinking, how can Stoicism help me break my writer's block so I can actually write? So I was kind of I had an agenda with Stoicism because I sort of came to it from the kind of Ryan Holiday point of view, like this kind of like brain hack. And then moved to Scotland to this little cottage here, and then the cemetery, and then this is where, in this space here, this quiet space, was when I really focused on my daily practice with Marcus Aurelius. And that's when I first read Marcus Aurelius. And that's when Stoicism really grabbed me, because the Marcus Aurelius is, as a literary work, really attractive to me. I just think it's beautiful.
Oh,
And I
it's
think
beautiful.
I really needed that as a writer to find a text that's poetic, and like the imagery and the metaphors, and it comes alive. It's a stunning work. And so I found beauty in Stoicism through Marcus Aurelius, and I think I needed a bit of aesthetic beauty for my heart and my soul, I guess, and just that daily practice really, as you know, and we've kind of touched on today, really helped me, and then Pierre Hadot helped me understand. Pierre Hadot gave me the map to how to read Marcus Aurelius, to read it as a text where Marcus Aurelius is actually shifting away from his self-centered view. In my journaling, I was very much ruminating, like writing for pages and pages and pages about myself and what was happening to me and all of that. And so studying Marcus Aurelius through the lens of Pierre Hadot and the ancient spiritual practices gave me opened the door for me to think about journaling as not a self-centered practice, but as a practice that would shift my perspective away from my own personal trauma. So that I could see myself in nature, my human nature, as being like everybody else's nature, and that really helped. And that was a really long answer to your question. But so in a lot of my journaling and in the stuff that I've been doing in the Stoic Salon with some of the members, we practice a lot with shifting perspective in how we do our journaling. So using the second person, like most of the Marcus Aurelius, at least in the translations, is second person. So you do this, you stop being distracted. You are. And so we played a lot with writing in our journals in the first person, and then flipping reframing into the second person, and seeing how that pulls us away from our own personal focus. So that was another sort of activity that we did, and that really helps. Yeah, so that's me in a nutshell, in a long, rambling nutshell.
No,
but
it's fascinating. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think I connected with the meditations, as you say, as a literature student. It's a classic.
Yeah.
So I've, I had different copies. I have more copies of the meditations than I realized I had when I began. But it's the timing. It's many things come together, and then you're really ready. To immerse yourself in it.
Yeah. Well, we're both big fans of Marcus Aurelius, aren't we? If only he knew how many women across the world are absolutely in love with him and his meditations.
I'd be sure he wouldn't let it get to him, just like he didn't let being a Roman emperor get to him.
He wouldn't, would it? He wouldn't. No, he wouldn't. Oh, my goodness. I can just imagine him at a book signing. He'd be like, yeah, group hugs, yeah. Yeah.
All right, I think Ranjini, it's a wonderful illustration of that. We just, we see how he did his work and how he tried to live. So it's really a wonderful illustration of just that, of just doing our work, purifying our intentions, our motivations, and just doing our work. And then the rest, we can never foresee or know. I mean, and as literature people, we know that. I mean, The Great Gatsby was a failure. Kate Chopin's Awakening was, disaster. D.H. Lawrence's books were sort of burned. He lived in exile. James Joyce went into exile. We just know that Van Gogh had very little success. So we just know, even in the artistic world, there's no way, we're so outcome focused as a society, but there really is no way to gauge what we're doing by looking at by being fixated on the outcome, but just being present building our character and doing our work.
Yeah. Yes, I like that. That's very,
Which
that's
is what you're doing with these podcasts and everything else.
Yeah.
You never know how something can help someone, you know. You may never hear of it, but that's, you know, I can think of so many things that people have said that just sort of stayed with me and helped me.
Yeah.
Or written.
Yeah, and the idea of actually, just focusing on this conversation right now, and being curious and attentive to this conversation right now, and not worrying about who's going to listen to this podcast and who's going to, I don't know, talk about it, and what do I put on social media about this podcast to get more listeners. That's an absolute distraction, and it's not even relevant, because what's really relevant is the conversation that we're having right now. Just you and me, and that's all we've got.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's liberating in a way. And it is, isn't it? And we're probably happier just focusing on this conversation without worrying about what's coming next and where it's going. Because for a lifetime, I've always worried. I've been a lifelong worrier about what's going to happen, who's going to see it, what are they going to say about me? You know, all this stuff that is completely not dependent on me. And I don't like to say use of the word control. I like to say what depends on me and what doesn't depend on me. I think I got that from the Pierre Hadot. And so the only thing that depends on me right now is to be curious and focused on Ranjini and my conversation.
Yeah. Well said, Kathryn. Well said.
I got it from you and Marcus. All righty then, shall we say goodbye? We'll say goodbye.
Bye.
All right. Thank you so much, Anne. I can't wait to talk to you again soon, and of course in June and beyond.
In June. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Kathryn, for a wonderful conversation. It's been great to hang out.
Yeah. Me too, you. All right.
Yeah. Bye.
See you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.